My name is Eric Mintel. By night, I'm a professional jazz musician, but by even later at night, I investigate the paranormal. I, along with my team, travel the country investigating all things paranormal. This is Eric Mintel Investigates.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Eric Mintel Investigates. On today's show, again, we've got incredible guests. I've got with me Bill Birnes, who you all know, and also we've got today Don Schmitt, who is not only an author and television personality, but he's also done some incredible research on the Roswell crash of 1947, which I'm sure you all know of and are familiar with. But today we're going to talk about the witnesses of the Roswell crash. So, Don, welcome to the show.
Well, my pleasure to be with both of you today. Thank you.
And Don, you're coming to us from around the Milwaukee area today.
Yes, around the Milwaukee area. That's as close as I prefer to get to Milwaukee. So.
And things are pretty kind of like normalcy in your area right
in
now?
My area, yes, fortunately, and I'm able to see people and do things and get-togethers, go out to restaurants, so and no outbreaks. So we're again very fortunate.
That's same here in Pennsylvania. The numbers are going down, so it's a good thing. But we just got to stay safe. But you know, I know you and Bill have also done, so much research on Roswell. You guys have talked to the witnesses. I know Bill had done a story with you on his UFO Hunters program.
Yes, well, with partner Tom Carey, actually, yeah.
Yeah, and a story in UFO Magazine. So I thought maybe we could start with, some of the intricacies of this story. Because it really is a deeper story than what, the main general public knows.
Well, as we've often referred to it as the ultimate cold case, file. The idea that even when we originally started the investigation, as we planned this out at the Center for UFO Studies, and I had been a special investigator for the late Dr. J.L. Hynek for the last 8 years of his life. And then I became his director of special investigations. And the one case I wanted to pursue was Roswell, because I was a total skeptic. The book that had come out, the Berlitz Moore book, Roswell Incident, that came out in 1980, I was so interested I never even read it until we needed to start our research in the fall of '88 at a CUFO's board meeting. I was serving on the board of directors at that time. And it's like, I want to go down to New Mexico. And I think we can wrap this Roswell nonsense up in a single weekend. Prove that it was a weather balloon device or something just as prosaic, just, in a matter of days. And that was February of '89 that Kevin Randall and we made our first trip. And the first few days, for only talking to some second, third-hand witnesses in the Albuquerque area, it looked like that was precisely going to be the situation, that we'd come away, well, that was a big bust, Roswell, weather balloon. But then we started to speak to first-hand witnesses, and specifically Mac Brazo's son, Bill Jr., and his wife, Shirley. And as they're describing handling the actual wreckage and its characteristics, and realizing, my God, even as we separated them, and they're describing the memory characteristics of this nearly indestructible metal-like material, paper thin, weightless in your hands. Even a bullet wouldn't penetrate it as it was described to us. And yet you could crease it, you could fold it, you could crumble it into a ball, and every time you placed it down, it would unravel. It would smooth out right before your eyes without the slightest sign of any damage. And so we quickly realized, my God, if these people are describing the actual debris, we need to get back down here as soon as possible. And as a result, and one witness leading to other family members, and there were specific witnesses such as George Wilcox. We tracked down his daughters, Phyllis McGuire, Elizabeth Talk, Walter Hott, who Bill certainly knows about, who was the public information officer at the Roswell Army Airfield at that time. So it became this cold case that still had witnesses, first-hand witnesses. And albeit all of our colleagues were telling us, well, you can't investigate something 40 years old back then. Well, we proved them all wrong. because not only did we investigate it, but we eventually interviewed over 600 people who were either directly or indirectly involved with this particular incident back in July of 1947.
When you and Tom, after Walter Haut had slipped and revealed on tape to Wendy O'Connor and Dennis Balthazar that he was actually at the Roswell crash site, you and Tom actually got him on the record, one of the most important eyewitnesses from start to finish, because not only did Walter Haut describe what happened, describing the aftermath of what happened, then described something very new in the whole annals of Roswell, which was how Roger Ramey visited the base prior to Jesse Marcel's flying the material back to Fort Worth. And that was fascinating, because you described in that interview and in that statement made by Walter Haut, the process of the cover-up. That's what's so much fascinated me in your book, The Witness to Roswell. Thank you, Bill. And you as an attorney, it's amazing how many of our colleagues, again, cast doubt on the notion that just because you didn't reveal the entire truth, you didn't provide your entire participation to an incident before, that somehow when you finally open up and tell the whole story, that somehow disqualifies you. That's right, and he even explained why. Right. He said that he had made a promise to his commanding officer, Blanchard, he would never talk about this while Blanchard and he were alive. Precisely. And so as a result, you said, fine, leave it up to your family to release the statement after your death. As a posthumous statement after the fact, and he finally, that's the one thing he agreed to. And you again, as an attorney, you realize that's an option. That's something that you can provide a potential, principal witness, that even after the fact that they still have an opportunity to tell their truth, their side of the story. And when he was when he was answering your questions, his attorney was in the room. And that was the important thing, because you had an attorney in the room and you had a notary in the room. Precisely. And a doctor had also okayed it the very evening before, because people were also questioning his health at the time. Walter was a diabetic and he would have highs and lows. And believe me, I'm a diabetic. I know exactly what you're saying. Precisely. And it's not a case of where your brain is any less, competent, you're any less lucid. It's just that, as you know, Bill, there are times that if you let your blood sugar get away from you, you start to lose your faculties. You have a 4:30 every day. And that's what it is. Occasion, it's like clockwork. We were on Larry King Live, and we actually filmed from the Roswell Museum in Roswell. And all at once, his daughter, Beth, calls me aside and she goes, Don, there's something wrong with Padre. And that's what both she and her sister, Julie, they affectionately called him, Padre. And I walked up to Walter, and he was just sitting there in a daze. And I said, Walter, we're on the air in 15 minutes. Walter, what's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? And he just wouldn't respond. I finally raced to a hallway, and I grabbed a picture of Butch Blanchard, his former boss, his former base commander in 1947. And I took it off the wall, and I ran and held it up to his face. Walter, who is this? Who is this? And he goes, whoa, that's the old man. And that's what they also affectionately called him back then, the old man. So I had him coming back. Well, what had happened was we quickly checked his sugar. It was over 400. Over 400. He had mistakenly... Glucose? Holy mackerel. And Larry King he also recognized the situation for what was going on. And Walter came on,
He said a few words, and then Larry apologized and said, now Walter isn't feeling well, so we're going to have to say goodnight to him. But Walter, we hope you'll be all right, and we'll do this again. Well, the skeptics and even a general portion of the UFO community, oh, that's proof that Walter Hatt's senile. That's proof that anything...
Infuriating.
Yeah. These people are beyond infuriating. They're heartless. They are hoping that our witnesses at that time still living would succumb to, as far as old age, as far as memory lapses, and the faster they would depart and shut up about Roswell, good riddance. So I'm sorry, I gave up on a lot of these people.
No, you're right. I'll tell you the other witness you interviewed, and that was really an intriguing witness. And it's where our paths crossed. Mickey Rooney's 8th father-in-law was Jan Chamberlain's father, Red Chamberlain.
Yes.
Because it was just fascinating. People say, well, how do you find UFOs? They find you. That's the fascinating thing about this. Here's a guy who nothing to do with UFOs. Mickey Rooney, he's an actor. Andy Hardy, right?
Right.
Suddenly, his 8th wife, this country singer, Jan Chamberlain, Jan Rooney now,
right.
Her husband happens to be
Mickey Rooney
in the loop.
Mm-hmm.
And what did he say? He said to his daughters after they found out that they knew about this, he said, oh, the government has all these files on UFOs and who they are and where they're from. They have all these files, but will never release them because all the world's governments would fall, religions would collapse. And she says this to me in the middle of our doing a book on Mickey Rooney and the FBI series.
You know what's fascinating about the whole thing here too is you guys were talking about the indirect witnesses to all of this. So let's go back to the woman who actually wrote a diary, and let's talk about her. And she actually was talking about handling the material. Bill, you were talking about that. Don, you want to elaborate on that?
Well, let Bill start because I like his passion about
the thing about
again, as a lawyer, how important a diary, how important this is.
Listen, no, that was fascinating because when you realize that when Mrs. Wilcox was doing this diary, she was doing it for the sole purpose of saying what it was like being the wife of the sheriff of Chavez County. It was the only purpose of doing it. And how she was just this believer. And then suddenly, in the middle of all this, and this is what struck me when her daughter basically mentioned it to me, she said, yeah, the thing that struck me was, why would my mom do this? And she didn't do it on the day it happened. She did it years later after my father had died. So it's like even she was complying with what the Army said, don't talk about this. And then she privately slips this thing in her diary, this like 2-page notice of what Brazel did, and that her husband, George Wilcox, he's the one who calls the Army base to say what Brazel had dropped off.
Mm-hmm.
absolutely no other agenda except, isn't this the darndest thing? And what Brazel dropped off was the actual material from the crash.
Correct. He brought in 2 boxes from the ranch. And one of the boxes after the Roswell Army Airfield. Now, keep in mind, this is a holiday weekend, 4th of July weekend. People are home with their families. They're even on leave. And it's important enough that when Sheriff Wilcox contacts the base, they alert the base commander. And he dispatches his head of intelligence, Major Jess Marcel, to go check it out. So he retrieves the 1 box at the sheriff's office. Now, before, the sheriff's office was torn down. The courthouse was demolished. We had Sheriff Wilcox's 2 daughters, Phyllis and Elizabeth, give us a tour, including the jail cells, which were upstairs. They were on a 2nd-story level. Their living quarters were right above the open lobby. As Brazel would have come in, their father's office was on the lower level, and he kept one of the boxes of debris. One box went to the military, and the other box Wilcox hid in his office closet. And to listen to the daughters describe the commotion a number of days after the weather balloon explanation took hold. People went back to their normal lives and ended up that flying saucer, crash story. And they hear these vehicles approaching from all directions. And we had them show us where the cafeteria was and how armed officers came in through one door, and they came in through a side door, and they came in through the main entrance. And the two daughters are describing how they're standing in the hallway overlooking the office. And they witness these MPs physically accost their father, the sheriff, and turn his arm up behind his back and push his face up against the wall, and with rifles drawn, demanding to know where the rest of the stuff was, where the rest of this wreckage was. And then to listen to Barbara Duggar, the granddaughter, who Inez, George's wife, George's widow, lived with for the last years of her life, describe how they not only threatened to kill us, they not only threatened to kill our daughters, but they threatened to kill all the grandchildren as well if we ever talked about this again. And then to listen to Barbara describe from, again, Inez's description, how a few days later, they called George out to the base. Well, George didn't trust them, especially after they got physical with him a few days earlier. So he took one of the deputies with him, just for protection. He needs protection, and he's the sheriff. Mm-hmm. And according to Inez, what she told Barbara was that when he came back, he was white as a ghost. He was all disheveled. He looked as though they once again had roughed him up. And keeping in mind, as Bill knows this, he never ran for re-election. As Barbara and as Phyllis, his daughter, Phyllis McGuire, told us, the incident destroyed him. Those were her words. The incident destroyed him. Now, again, it's like we interviewed his chief deputy, Tommy Thompson. And Thompson had told Glenn Dennis and another witness in avoiding us, in blowing us off, that they told me if I ever talked to them, at the time it was myself and Kevin Randall, if I ever talk to them, they will blow my head off. Well, again, he's chief deputy of Chavez County in Roswell. And the military, the government is threatening law enforcement. So I'm sorry, martial law was not declared. That's the giveaway. And as a result, they had absolutely no jurisdiction. This rose to that level. This was so extreme that there was nothing in their Army field book. There was nothing they could, rely on as to a path of operation in dealing with this situation. So they did what they unfortunately did best. And that was where they got physical. They actually demonstrated that we have bigger guns than you do, so to speak.
Look at the story that Alpha Rose's father told. He was the base maintenance guy, a handyman working at the base. He was doing plumbing, doing carpentry. And he told his daughter, this person, that he was at the base standing by a hangar when he sees the whole base suddenly come alive, ambulances, trucks, and they bring in this life form on a stretcher right in front of him. He looks down, he sees this thing, the thing looks at him, he says it almost communicates with him, then they bring it inside the hangar, and they a bunch of officers beat this guy up until the captain walks by and says, leave him alone, he works here. He's not going to tell. And in fact, he didn't tell until the very end of his life when he's dying of lung cancer. He tells his daughter.
Tells his daughter, right. And so again, you go by the press accounts, you go by the spoken word, and then you go by the actions. You go by what actually transpired on the base. Now, one of the officers on the base told us at one time, you know, do you think we needed this? Do you think we needed all this excitement? We already had the atomic bomb. You know, we were the first atomic bomb squadron in the world that time. So we didn't do this for publicity. I mean, it had been suggested by a reporter with CBS at one point that is it possible that a bunch of the guys sitting over a few beers at the PX one evening decided, well, let's concoct this whole UFO crash story and we'll all make some money off of it at some point. And it's like, yeah, you already have the bomb, and you wait till everybody's just about gone, and you're in your mid-80s, and now we're going to break the story. Now we're going to finally make some money off of this. And he goes, yeah, it does sound pretty silly.
And they didn't even break the story. That's the funny part about it. The story actually broke with Jesse Marcel all the way back in 1978.
78. And then the very first press release, that famous press release, the point also being they started it. They're the first ones who had announced they actually captured a flying saucer. We didn't do that. The witnesses didn't do that.
That's right. And the press release, that press was part of the cover-up. Precisely.
As you were alluding to earlier, Bill, as far as what also, again, colleagues in the field never take into account is that the very day, Sunday the 6th, that Brazel first brings the material into Roswell, Wilcox contacts Jess Marcel at the base. He in turn notifies Colonel Blanchard, the base commander. Blanchard dispatches not only Marcel, but also counterintelligence officer by the name of Captain Sheridan Cabot. In the event it's something foreign, that's the whole point. Why do you send out a counterintelligence? Because you can't identify the material. And you aren't sending out just a couple of grunts to check it out. You're sending the two head officers of your intel departments, also suggesting how interesting, how provocative this material is. So Blanchard, going up the chain of command, contacts his boss at Fort Worth Army Airfield, who happens to be, as you mentioned earlier, General Roger Ramey. Ramey's on 4th of July holiday leave. He's at a plane dedication. He's visiting with family in Denton, Texas. So his chief of staff, Colonel Thomas DeBose, takes the question, and he immediately says, I will contact the Pentagon. And it wasn't like, well, tell me what you find, let me know what happens. No, I'll contact the Pentagon. And he gets that call back from General Clemens McMullen, who is Deputy Commander of Strategic Air Command, demanding that some of the wreckage be brought to Washington that evening, that night. So Washington already has wreckage in hand late Sunday, July 6th. The press release announcing that they had captured the flying saucer isn't until Tuesday, noon, Mountain Time on July 8th, a day and a half later. So don't tell me this was a knee-jerk reaction. Don't tell me that it was Marcel or Walter Hatt or even Colonel Blanchard that overreacted and they stepped out of bounds. They put out that press release. Washington was part of the cover-up. They were the part of the scripting of that very press release.
Absolutely. And you brought us another witness for that one episode, Earl Fulford, who was a staff sergeant.
Yes.
And the thing that struck me about that was so important wasn't so much, it was certainly Earl Fulford at the debris field, but it was Earl Fulford who said one thing that really triggered something. He said that you couldn't smoke a cigarette in the hangars, right, with all the fuel fumes. So They would go out on the edge of the runway to have their cigarettes. Bunch of Army guys, bunch of grunts, sergeants and enlisted personnel sitting on the runway, right, shooting the breeze, smoking cigarettes. What do they see? Dazzling lights in the sky over the runway. So even before the crash, they're seeing these things over the runway. Then when they find out that, it's supposed to be a weather balloon, which they know it isn't because they could see what they were, Fulford says was, oh, they were building the weather balloons right across the street, so he knew what they were.
Let me ask you this. Let me just chime in here real quick. I want to ask you guys about, I know I don't want to veer off of this a little bit, but how does the second crash feed into this, the one in Corona? Now, what's your take on that? Because there were entities seen there. There was wreckage taken from there. Actually, I think one of the extraterrestrials was alive.
Mm-hmm.
What is your take on that?
Stanton Friedman was the first one, and this was back in May of 1990. We had a conference in Alexandria, just outside of DC, and we brought in a dozen witnesses, and it was sponsored by the Prince of Liechtenstein, Hans Adam II, at that time, and Hans Adam was very interested in Roswell and possibilities. All of a sudden, here was Stan making this proposal that it was a collision of two objects, that there were two objects involved. Well, that was when he was still trying to paint the scenario that there were two distinct crash sites, one out on the plains of San Augustine, 200 miles west of Roswell, and then the other being on the Brazel Ranch. Well, he was actually the foreman on the ranch in Corona, okay? So as we investigated more and more the plains of San Augustine, we learned that there was a plane crash out there in 1945. Wreckage was scattered for miles. There were bodies that were thrown as far as from the impact site. And tying that in with the rocket launches from White Sands to the south, whenever there would be a scheduled launch, they would evacuate all the ranchers throughout that region, put them up in a motel in Socorro, wouldn't tell them a word, but it was all very clandestine. They made it seem all very secretive, that type of thing. So it all created this urban legend. It all painted this impression that there's something big that had happened there, which necessitated, the military coming into the region. And there was also a radar tracking facility west of Socorro, just north of the plains of San Augustine. So the military was always in and out without any explanation. So Friedman was playing up this idea that there was a crash there. All of our information, all of our witnesses demonstrate that there was one craft, there was a debris field that covered an area of almost 3/4 of a mile long, which was what Brazel discovered. There was a secondary body site about 2.5 miles from that debris field, which Brazel also discovered. And then there was a final impact site where there was a pod, a capsule, egg-shaped. Walter Haut described it in his statement, about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. And that was just 35 miles north of town. And that's where 2 additional bodies and the survivor were recovered. So 3 distinct sites, all along one trajectory line, one crash, one object.
Unbelievable.
Let's talk about the survivor.
So Don, the survivor, whatever happened to that alien?